Matt Walsh is a leftist. He doesn't believe in objective truth. He centers his arguments around non-facts, and he creates his identity as he so chooses. The moment that stopped me was toward the end when he decided that although he was trying to see the truth objectively as possible, he felt that it was fair to assume and presume and speculate and thus editorialize what actually happened in the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was lynched in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman, and he was kidnapped, brutally beaten, face unrecognizable. He was also lynched, and his killers were acquitted for the crime. Matt Walsh says Emmett Till's story is a lie, and he thinks so because the claim that Emmett Till was merely murdered for whistling at a white woman doesn't match what the victim actually claimed happened. She said he also grabbed her and said nasty comments. He also thinks that
present the story. According to Bryant's testimony in court, as well as her memoir, Emmett Till grabbed her hand and said, "How about a date, baby?" And when she tried to flee, Emmett Till followed her to the cash register, forcefully grabbed her waist and said, "What's the matter, baby? Can't you take it?"
Because the recantation of the victim's story was never sourced, meaning it's something that people say but we don't actually have evidence for, that it probably didn't happen. And because they didn't source the recantation, that means that we should question the story in its entirety, and history in its entirety, for that matter. Walsh finds it necessary to question whether Emmett Till's story happened the way that we say that it did, because in his own words, they lied about Karmelo Anthony, so what else have they lied about? And whether Karmelo's case has been covered fairly is not something that I want to adjudicate right now, because there's something deeper that is problematic with what Walsh is suggesting. There's some shadowy figure, some they out there that lied about Karmelo Anthony. And that means that we should reinterpret history, for Walsh at least, because we don't actually understand what is true and what is false, what is a fact and what is a non-fact. And there's a pipeline here, Karmelo to Emmett Till, where the Black American is severed from the whole of his existence and centered on a defense of his innocence. To be fair to Walsh, the DOJ concluded in 2021 that they didn't have sufficient evidence to confirm or deny the recantation.
The department has closed the latest federal investigation into the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till in rural Mississippi. Federal authorities reopened the case 3 years ago after a new book reported that Bryant had denied in an interview that Till had made any advances. In theory, that could have meant she lied in decades
of the victim. But Walsh needs that DOJ to say that the recantation never happened. But it doesn't say that it never happened. It says that the evidence that it happened is inconclusive. He also spends a good chunk of the video talking about Emmett Till's father's criminal record, which obviously has no bearing on the 1955 murder at all. So the work that the section is doing is...
I think it's worth noting, Emmett's father was named Lewis Till. He enlisted in the Army during World War II to avoid going to prison for domestic violence. But Lewis Till's behavior did not change overseas. He was court-martialed for the murder of an Allied civilian during the Italian campaign, as well as the rape of 2 pregnant Italian women. Ultimately, he was found guilty.
Framing Emmett Till as someone who's likely to do these types of things. Then he commits the motte-and-bailey fallacy by trying to say that although his father was a criminal, that doesn't mean that Emmett Till is necessarily a criminal too. But if the father's criminal record didn't have anything of substance to add to the subject of conversation, what actually then is it being brought up for? Of course, it's being brought up as a way to interpret and reinterpret the facts of the Emmett Till case, which is in conflict with Walsh's claims that he's trying to be objective. Walsh is trying to correct the historical record with the accuser, which tells us that he's already decided that Till was guilty, and he is using propaganda to take a historical moment and reinvent the meaning of the historical moment. Walsh's whole brand is that the left rewrites history to serve their identity, but he's actually guilty of doing the same thing. For example, he once tried to say that white people were indigenous to America, and he acknowledges the fact that white people are in fact not indigenous to America, and he says that because the indigenous people lost the war and were conquered, that means that they are no longer indigenous to the land, and we should claim the title native for ourselves. We, meaning white people. In August of 2024, Walsh tweeted, "I am native to America. The difference is my ancestors won the battle and they lost." And the pressure that he's under is historical pressure. The fact that many people say that white people are not actually indigenous to anywhere. And this is him trying to solve the problem. He's trying to solve it by just simply taking the title and making it his own, even though Europeans are just not native to America. And Walsh wants to say that because the Europeans came and conquered the Native Americans, that they beat them at their own game, and
the Indian tribes were totally conquered and vanquished. After spending hundreds and hundreds of years among themselves, slaughtering each other and fighting over land, and every piece of land that any of those Indian tribes occupied, they occupied it because they killed the people who occupied it before them. And then the Europeans came in and beat them at their own game, basically.
The word conquest in his story entitles him to, I guess, claim that he was always in the land. And in doing so, he erases Native American history, but also his own history, because your history is a story of settlement, of conquest and settlement. It's a contradiction to say that you are native to a place that you conquered through conquest.
And you got conquered, okay? It happens. It's happened all over the world. And so it's not your land anymore.
And he wants to know how long white people have to live somewhere before they get to consider themselves native to that place. And this is just a confused question, because if you live somewhere from the beginning of history, meaning you were the first people to live in that land, then that would make you native. So the answer to the question is, as long as white people from Europe come from Europe, they can never actually call themselves native. In both the Till case and the native case, Walsh is reinterpreting history so that it can fit a political narrative while masking the rhetoric around objectivity so that people can be propagandized to believe a lie that will get him a political outcome that he sees fit and right. For example, when I pick up Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon, I get a strong sense of truth. As he describes the experience of a black man, I see myself in those descriptions. But I conclude opposite of Frantz Fanon. And this is because Fanon describes a man whose values are shaped by Western ideology and Western norms and all the things. This description is true, and he describes it in precise detail in certain parts. But he moves from description to editorialization or reinterpretation when he starts to tell me how to feel about my experience. And that is the line between phenomenology and propaganda. It's when you go from describing experience to interpreting experience in a way that takes the neutrality away from experience. And maybe this is a problem in general with the phenomenological project, because the language that we use and the history attached to the language that we use also alters how the description of experience is received. Where Fanon takes lived experience and smuggles in interpretation and thus takes the neutrality away for a political project, Walsh does the same with history. He takes collective history, whether white or black, and he explains the objective part while in the same breath moving away from the objective by smuggling in reinterpretation, which is precisely what propaganda is. If the left is supposed to be infecting and indoctrinating with leftist ideology on the ground that they don't actually believe in objective truth, but rather they understand that the reinterpretation is necessary because our phenomenological experience requires alteration to be described, then Matt Walsh absolutely fits into that category. So Walsh is leftist in essence, insofar as his definition of what a leftist is someone who denies history in favor of personal identity, but he does the exact thing. And so it doesn't matter that he plays for the Republicans, and it wouldn't matter if he switched to the Democrats, because what he seems to think leftism is the denial of objective history and objective truth, to the extent that when a leftist says something about history or says something is true, he has to go and make sure that they aren't reinterpreting history. But in his doing so, he finds himself reinterpreting history the same way that he accuses the leftists of doing. And therefore, Matt Walsh is leftist in essence. And this ain't just the right does it too kind of argument. Because if the right adopts Matt Walsh's methodology, then the very thing that institutions rest on, which is continuity, is lost, and we actually don't know who holds history outside of those who use it for political projects and make out of concrete truths propaganda. And you can't be conservative and deny objective history in favor of getting more people to vote away, as if voting is what makes you conservative. Matt Walsh calls this stuff the culture war. And in war, there's often political pundits and powerful government entities that use propaganda to get people to buy into the war. But as we war, our institutional identity, in this case, is being undone, because truth is a shared project learned not individually, not created by some abstract person, but by a collective we. And this is why we want to preserve institutions. And Matt Walsh is fundamentally in conflict with that. Next time you listen to an argument from one of these big political pundits, listen carefully when they frame their argument as objective, but smuggle in interpretation and reinterpretation, because what they're doing is trying to alter your perspective on experience. If you want to see this test run down on one of the biggest names in philosophy, check out my comp video.